was a time when our children stood at attention, and in one united voice recited the Pledge of Allegiance. When strength and honor meant something. When standing for our flag meant something. There was a time when our history was taught with pride and respect. When respect was given to those who served, bled, and died to protect and defend our freedoms. It was when we, the people, decided our future and had a voice that was heard. We are all bound by a feeling deep inside that people in power are exploiting and abusing us while using the powerful media apparatus to pretend they're not. All we ever wanted to do was the right thing, but they kept telling us we were wrong. We started to believe them and let ourselves forget everything that once made us strong. We became weak. We elected traitors to govern us. We allowed evil to prey on us. Those who claimed to represent us gave us false hope, made false promises. The evil and corruption only grew. They invented the word globalism to advance on their agenda of tyranny undetected, using fake narratives of social justice to neuter our resolve to fight back and silence us with shame. If you've had the misfortune of living through a globalist revolution, you will remember many false promises of prosperity and justice for all, but observing only poverty, violence, and death. One after another, these nations were robbed of every resource the land and waters produced. Citizens who would not surrender their freedoms were threatened, marginalized, or even killed. Those who did were weaponized against the rest. They blamed us for destroying the environment, for poverty, for slavery, for not going to college, or for just giving up. What you must learn is that it has always been them, a colossal global criminal class who had risen up and occupied every level of corporate, legal, and political power imaginable. In 2016, they were preparing for an endgame that was to start with the election of Hillary Clinton, and within 8 years would have culminated in nothing less than a mass global nuclear holocaust. Yet somehow, while humanity was taking its last step over the precipice of extinction, there was a miracle. You may know it as the plan. Brave patriots set into motion a sophisticated military-grade sting operation against the overwhelming network of corruption that had led all the way to the top. By the time the good people of the world learned of the frightening reality they were living in, and how close we came to the end of it all, we had already been saved. Raging around us is the final phase of a vast global shadow war, not between nations, but between the forces of good and the most unimaginable of evils. They know what's coming. It is now more clear than ever. Never in our history have they been this exposed. Never in our history have they come out from the shadows to fight. The truth is clearly visible. They defend the violent criminal gangs of MS-13. They openly promote the dismantling of our borders. They said there would be nuclear war if Trump remained in office. They encouraged violence against those who spoke out. They pushed hate, war, and economic decline. They wanted to stop peace talks with North Korea. They called for Trump to be impeached, not even providing a reason. They tried to get us to hate America, and so many obeyed. But now, each day more and more, we see they are terrified. They knew this day would come. The entire world is watching. Patriots from around the world know that if America should fall, so falls the world. That's why we have Q. We the people, patriots everywhere, stand at the ready. We volunteer our talents willingly. We fight. We think for ourselves. Dark to light.
Never been warned like this before, all of us, about climate change, nor have so many countries agreed quite this much on the clear and present danger it represents. Here is the takeaway. Unless the world changes course quickly and dramatically, the fundamental systems that support human civilization are at risk. This is all coming from the UN.
We've been told that Earth's climate has been changing. And for 30 years, scientists supporting the United Nations view have inserted the idea of man-made global warming into our consciousness, into our politics, schools, and even our churches.
There's one issue that will define the contours of this century more dramatically than any other, and that is the urgent and growing threat of a changing climate. We cannot condemn our children and their children to a future that is beyond their capacity to repair.
With current climate trends setting record cold temperatures, many are questioning global warming theories. And a growing number of climate scientists are seeing that global temperature data no longer shows a heating trend, and that most of the global warming predictions have failed to come true. And scientists who challenge the global warming consensus are now targeted for attack. John Casey is a highly credentialed scientist and engineer who has stood up to the establishment on global warming. He sees solar cycles as the primary driver of climate change, not carbon emissions. Casey's controversial new bestseller, Dark Winter, argues that global warming has ended and a new, more ominous threat faces humanity. A period of plummeting temperatures that's enveloping the planet that will radically change life on Earth, including political unrest, famines, mass migrations of people, and even a wave of unprecedented earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Casey, a former White House Space Program advisor and space shuttle engineer, is the president of the Space and Science Research Corporation, a respected climate science organization. He has been a voice of reason challenging global warming propaganda, as he shows, along with a number of leading climate scientists, that the Earth has actually entered a period of rapid cooling as sunspot activity begins its downward trend. Not a member of the academic elite, Casey's scientific, real-world credentials set him apart.
According to NASA and NOAA's own science data and their satellite data that we monitor, the Arctic and the Antarctic are both getting colder. Sea ice is growing rapidly, and so the reality is quite different between what the warmists have predicted and what is really happening with our climate. This is even more graphic when you look at the relational cycle theory and what it predicted. For example, we predicted that the global warming would end between 2007 and 2010. We had a news conference in 2008 to announce that it had in fact already ended, that a new cold era had begun. All of the predictions then, and there are many from the Space and Science Research Corporation and other global cooling researchers, have in general come to pass, whereas most of the major predictions from the UN and even our own U.S. science agencies in the last 6 years have failed utterly.
Al Gore, President Obama, the UN, and other global warming leaders, rather than admit their predictions have not come true, have chosen to attack the very scientists who have been proven right and have stood up to global warming narratives. Dr. Willie Soon of the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics studies the impact of solar cycles on Earth's climate. Dr. Soon receives funding from the fossil fuel industry for his research because scientists backed by global warming funding have cut him off.
The sun, of course, in terms of its light energy output, is probably the only true external driver of the Earth climate system, because there is no other forces on Earth that would supply that amount of energy for the air to move around, the ocean current to move around, or trees to grow. So there is no doubt that the sun is the main driver and supplier of energy to the Earth weather and climate system. They are clearly promoting the vision that if we do not cut our carbon dioxide emission, disaster, crisis, whichever bad connotation you can find, will come to Earth. So it is that kind of alarmism that appalls me as a scientist. There is no one in the world who would insist that everything is having to do with the sun. All we are trying to do is that there's this plausible picture of how the sun could cause some of the changes, in the climate system, why not study it carefully? It's very, very difficult, in my opinion, to try to insist and suggest that carbon dioxide, even as of today, when we emit this carbon dioxide, is going to drive the climate system. It's a complete false picture.
Climate change or climate variation occurs all the time, as it has for millions of years. These changes in climate are produced by, we believe, changes in solar or solar system, gravitational field, and energy output from the sun. As a result, we have studied, and I specifically have studied, a family of cycles that do cause this climate change. That includes a 206-year-long cycle, which is the one that is changing over now and ended the past global warming and has begun a new cycle of global cooling.
In January 2015, President Obama declared 2014 to be the hottest year on record, despite recent revelations that data he used is flawed or fabricated.
2014 was the planet's warmest year on record.
As the debate today rages over man-made CO2 and its link to global warming, and despite claims of 2014 being the hottest year ever, there has been a problem. Analysis reveals that for the past decade, global temperatures have, in fact, stabilized, and that some areas of the planet are actually cooling.
We've heard in the State of the Union address from President Obama that 2014 was the warmest year on record. Is that true? Is that accurate? Certainly the global warming camp will go along with that. I mean, this is the President of the United States making this statement. But on the scientific community side, those of us who follow temperature measurement and temperature trends know that the President wasn't accurate once more in his proclamations on climate change. 2014, according to 5 major global data sets that we follow on global temperature, both atmospheric and oceanic, says that it may have been the 3rd or 6th warmest in the last 15, but was clearly not the warmest. What we've been told for quite some time now is that climate change of any kind is caused by mankind. That is a modification of what used to be called man-made global warming. When it became apparent that the Earth was cooling, that climate terminology shifted to just climate change, and in my opinion was simply a political co-op to include virtually any change of climate somehow being blamed on mankind. It is more a political definition than a realistic one.
A review of the 5 major global temperature data sets, records for the last 18 years, are far from conclusive that global warming has continued despite what we are being told.
The idea of science is you're really supposed to be skeptical. So there's always a quest to verify what we know, to understand that we haven't made a mistake, and that we continue on and develop science. And if we've closed our mind, if we close the doors, we are now shutting ourselves out from the real truth, which is what science is all about after all.
How did global warming become a global obsession? A Hollywood storyline was not a bad way to start. In the next segment, John Casey confronts the conventional thinking on climate change.
It's pretty rare that you'll encounter somebody who says the problem you're trying to solve simply doesn't exist. Today's Congress is full of folks who stubbornly and automatically reject the scientific evidence about climate change. They will tell you it is a hoax.
Anyone who confronts the dogma of the day will find out that, like all other prior instances in history, you get ignored first and then you get attacked.
It's pretty rare that you'll encounter somebody who says the problem you're trying to solve simply doesn't exist.
And it has always been a confrontation between establishment science and the mavericks that come along that say, hold it a minute, you need to consider something else.
In recent years, a handful of intrepid climate experts began seeing inconsistencies in the data supporting the global warming theory. Though all of these scientists agree that the planet had been warming for the past 200 years, the most recent climate data indicates the Earth's warming has stopped, and temperatures are now either stable or cooling.
One member of Congress actually says the world is cooling.
Recently, Britain's Telegraph newspaper headlined the biggest science scandal ever, The paper reported that scientists had been caught tampering with recorded temperatures, from ones that showed a clear cooling trend to that of a warming one.
There's also a summary for policymakers. It's put together by policymakers, and in many cases, they go back to the scientists and say, can you change the science document to match our summary? We want to beef this up. We want to make it look worse. That's not the way science is done. What we have to remember is climate changes and climate fluctuates. And really, while we think humans have an impact on our environment, which we do, the global climate system is still far too complex to be simply affected by one change in one small component of it.
Climate experts like Dr. Legates and John Casey think many experts are cooking the books. Climatologists challenging the global warming consensus believe the scientific data proves them right and shows that the sun's sunspot activity plays a much greater role in the Earth's climate than man-made carbon emissions. After years of research, Casey has published his book, Dark Winter, based on his relational cycle, or RC, theory. He says records of temperatures and atmospheric CO2 during the past 650,000 years indicate that Earth's temperature always rises first, followed by a rise in carbon dioxide by several hundred years.
A warmer Earth gives birth to more vegetation, which in turn has a more active carbon cycle. And so as a result, carbon dioxide may in fact follow the temperature change as opposed to being a leading indicator.
Published papers clearly shows that it is always the temperature rises first by at least several hundred years to a few thousand years. And then the carbon dioxide curve responds and it follows. So it is a very clear scientific consensus on this issue.
It's very important to understand that we were, in fact, in a state of global warming right up until the middle of the 2000s. But then it stopped. It stopped because the sun stopped it. It stopped on the sun because the sun's 206-year cycle reversed direction from warming to cooling. That's the big picture. It's nothing more complicated than that. And for those of us who follow the sun, that's why we're so encouraged with the reliability of these solar cycles. And I encourage everyone who used to believe the man-made global warming story, like I used to believe, to look into solar cycles, to look at solar activity, and for sure, for the next few years or few decades, please follow what's happening with the sun. And here we have the northern hemisphere, the tropics, and the southern hemisphere. Northern hemisphere has been, as you can see, the 2003 to 2007 period where the peak occurred. It's been meandering, no change. Now see, this is what we were talking about. This is the secondary peak in the current 11-year solar cycle, which is more powerful than the first peak. Now, what that represented, unbeknownst to most people studying climate, is that the sun is sending us a signal that it's about to go into deep cold phase. This is a crucial signal from the sun that absolutely no one in the mainstream media is aware of. And in fact, most people in the scientific community are not aware of. But it's one that I found and wrote up the significance of this important event in the last Global Climate Status Report. But this is the crucial signal that we've been waiting for all along.
In the next segment, John Casey reveals how politicians have forced scientists to conform data to their global warming agenda. In 2007, with the help of Al Gore's Oscar-winning documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, global warming was catapulted onto the national and international stage. From the United Nations General Assembly in New York to the halls of Congress, global warming adherents have been sounding the alarm with scenarios of impending global chaos.
We've seen celebrities and prominent politicians like former Vice President Al Gore step up to the plate, issue a movie called Inconvenient Truth. He received an Oscar. He went on to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, along with Dr. Pachauri from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for creating awareness of this threat of man-made climate change caused by CO2.
Faced with record cold winters now engulfing the planet, global warming theorists still won't change their conclusion that human-produced CO2 emissions are responsible for global warming, and that by the year 2100, a disastrous overheating of the planet will force wildlife species to the brink of extinction. melt ice caps and glaciers north to south, pushing sea levels upward. Soon overwhelming us, flooding New York, Miami, San Francisco, and other major coastal cities around the world, as numerous and more destructive hurricanes were predicted to strike, and that the Arctic would be ice-free by 2013, and that global warming is not only real, but that it has been caused by human activity, and the United States economy is the leading villain. But none of their dire predictions have come true, yet they insist on massive government regulations and taxes on anyone using carbon-based fuels.
If we step back and we look at the big picture on this climate debate, we see that there are actually three groups involved. The first group is the best known. It's the one that's the man-made global warming theory caused by industrial greenhouse gases, primarily CO2, from our industry plants. This group is best known by the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UNIPCC, and its periodic climate reports that espouse the greenhouse gas theory and say that the world is in danger and at great threat because of mankind's CO2. What we have found out since then is very different. And as a result, a second group has formed to oppose that first group. That first group also added President Obama in more recent years, a primary advocate for greenhouse gas and man-made global warming. We see that this second group opposes that first group. They have in fact done a great deal of research and come up with scientific rationale to show that the fundamental science of the greenhouse gas theory simply is not that important in climate change. But there is a third group. The third group is the one to which I belong and other scientists and climatologists around the world. We believe that the first two groups are really done a great job on the debate, but we need to stop the debate. And the reason we need to stop is because the sun is in fact the primary driver for climate change, and the new change, the new cold climate produced by the sun demands that we all start getting prepared. We don't have much time left. I think it's important to understand that the vast majority of people are simply too busy with day-to-day life to really look into the question of what's causing climate change below the headlines of the news media, below the words from the news anchor on the evening news. What I have come to learn, the most important issue that we all face, is really how do you differentiate? What do you believe? Another example is the melting of the sea ice in the Arctic. We've heard many people predict when the Arctic would be absolutely ice-free. It never happened, of course. Other scientists from our own government agencies predicted it would be gone by 2013. That never happened. We were also told that ocean temperatures and atmospheric temperatures could only go up. Well, what's the reality? We now know after decades of global temperature tracking, especially during the satellite era, with very accurate data, that ocean temperatures actually stopped warming in 2003 and have been essentially cooling or stable since then. Who can the average person on the street trust when it comes to whether we're warming, whether we're cooling, and what data to use? If we look at the many predictions made by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, our own U.S. scientific establishment, we see that they've made many predictions that have never come true. For example, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has predicted that global warming over the last 15 years should have increased by 0.8 degrees Fahrenheit. It didn't even come close. The actual temperature measurement was 0.09 degrees Fahrenheit by one data set, and even colder than that by other data sets. The track record of the global warming community is a terrible track record, with error rates 90 to 300%, with major predictions like melting sea ice and glacial ice that simply haven't happened, with ocean temperatures and atmospheric temperatures that have stopped warming and now gone to cooling. So clearly, the solar physics community, the global cooling community, has gotten this one right for over a decade now.
In the next segment, John Casey reveals how a new solar cycle will radically impact life on Earth. In the aftermath of recent unprecedented cold winters, The UN and climate scientists are scrambling to explain their theories, when the scientific data and the experience of hundreds of millions living on the planet shows it is simply not true. Today, John Casey's book, Dark Winter, says the Earth is on the cusp of a significant drop in global temperatures as sunspot activity has already diminished and is expected to plummet to near zero over the next 5 to 10 years. Still, the UN and leading scientists and many politicians refuse to consider the impact of solar cycles on temperature. With their reputations on the line and untold billions of investment into the global warming theory at risk, questioning the near consensus thinking has not been allowed. In Dark Winter, author John Casey shows that the sun is clearly moving into a period known as a solar minimum, a period marked by greatly reduced sunspots and solar flares. As this solar activity declines, Earth temperatures will continue to fall, and these solar minimums have other consequences.
One of the other things we've learned about studying history and its relationship to climate variation has been a very startling component to this story. The fact that we have our very worst earthquakes and our very worst, largest volcanic eruptions at the bottom of these cold solar hibernations.
Today's rate of volcanic eruptions is at the highest point in recorded history. Substantial volcanic activity is being recorded in Chile, Iceland, and the ongoing massive eruptions in Indonesia. The combination of increased volcanic activity and massive ash plumes distributed high in the atmosphere shield the planet from the sun and ensures the Earth will enter a period of intense cooling.
Research I've participated in with other eminent geologists around the planet is very clear on this. Our worst earthquakes and volcanoes, our worst geophysical events happen at the same time the planet gets coldest. Let's look at the last time we had a solar hibernation in the 1793 to 1830 period, the Dalton minimum, if you will. The world's largest series of earthquakes occurred at that very time we were at the bottom of that solar hibernation. This was from 1811 to 1812. It didn't occur in Asia. It didn't occur in California or Mexico or Turkey or China. It occurred right here in the middle of the United States. Many people that live there know it well. It's called the New Madrid Fault. And the New Madrid Fault erupted with 3 catastrophic earthquakes, 2 7.5s and an 8.0 approximately, within just a few months of each other during the winter of 1811-1812. If that same earthquake tragedy were to happen, the U.S. economy would be devastated. Hundreds of thousands would be dead. The infrastructure in the central U.S. would be totally destroyed. Also on the volcano side, 1815, at the bottom of the last solar hibernation, the last cold phase of the sun, the world's largest recorded volcanic eruption happened in Mount Tambora in Indonesia. Mount St. Helens, May 18, 1980, that every American is aware of, was a catastrophic eruption as well, killed many people still living near the base of that volcano, caused dust to be scattered across much of the northwestern U.S. and the Rockies. However, Mount Tambora was 100 times the size of Mount St. Helens. The question of whether volcanoes have an impact on the climate is very real. It's another area that the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change pretty much dismissed. It wasn't even in a major factor in these early reports.
On TV, in our workplaces and schools, Americans have been conditioned to believe that we are responsible for climate change. They have been exposed to a generation-long barrage of global warming propaganda, scare tactics, and manipulation of data to impose a socialist economic agenda on governments across the globe.
It's interesting when you look at the debate over the causes of climate change to see that the vast amount of data that's most accurate are being simply ignored. We still see those like Al Gore and those who oppose Al Gore go back and forth arguing over the role of CO2. But we see very little attention being paid to the most accurate theories, the most reliable science, and the best climate prediction records. They're totally ignored. Certainly one of the main contentions of the warming crowd has been the pointing to weather extremes as a sign of man-made global warming. Again, the reality is that that's not the case. Clearly, we should expect during a transition period from the past global warming to the new global cooling, that we will see periodic interactions of deeper, more powerful cold fronts with the still existing warm fronts coming out from the tropics. That will produce extreme weather events, no question. But to say that man-made climate change as a result of CO2 from industrial plants is at the cause is simply not the case. There's been no real demonstration of the connection. So it's not the weather extremes that's important, it's the trend lines. And trend lines are clearly showing we're heading into a cold era. When people hear what I and others like me have to say, they're shocked. Their mouths drop open. They shake their heads. They can't believe what they're hearing because it's so compelling. And that's the power of the truth. But right now, we're still seeing the remnants of the 30 years of propaganda that says that mankind controls the climate, not the sun. These are ominous changes on the sun. Everyone needs to know about them and prepare for them. I am confident that we are growing. There are more people that are hearing this story, hearing the message, reading my book, Dark Winter, and books like it that tell the truth about the climate. So in time, I think we'll achieve the mission and that most of the people will have heard.
In the next segment, John Casey draws a picture of the looming disaster the new cold era will bring. As recent winters break record after record for snow and sub-zero temperatures, the global warming consensus is starting to melt away, making room for a new understanding of climate change. If predictions of a solar minimum causing intense cold prove true, how should people prepare for a cooling planet?
One of the other very important frequent questions I get during my presentations around the country is, okay, we accept what you're saying, but what do we do to prepare for this new cold era? The first thing we need to do is cross an intellectual bridge, a very difficult bridge that transitions from the 30 years of global warming propaganda to a reality based on science and the most reliable science that tells us what's coming. Step number 2 entails studying history. Learn what happened in the last solar hibernations, the Dalton minimum, the Maunder minimum, the Little Ice Age. Study what people did, how they got through it, and how they reacted. And that will give you a good sense. The clear problem that begins, however, is one of food shortage. Unquestionably, that's the main ill effect of these cold eras, because the crops simply die. So what does that mean? It means that we've been able to grow crops at a much higher latitude than we've ever been able to. More crops at a higher latitude. Both of those components are going to disappear as the cold goes further south, as crops have to move further south to adapt. So what do? It means we better have our own food storage on hand. I recommend a 1-year food supply. Be prepared to defend your home and your food supply. When we look back in history, when the food riots began, neighborhoods were destroyed, farms were destroyed, food granaries were destroyed. People would do anything back then to get food. That included killing their neighbors. We need to face the harsh reality of what people become when they start to starve. It's probably one of the worst lessons of history, but it's a lesson, unfortunately, our modern world will have to face in the coming times.
These solar changes will have a cataclysmic impact on Earth and lead to catastrophe for humans who do not prepare.
Still, there is optimism. Optimism comes from knowing what's coming, being prepared, being informed. It's far worse than being told that the Earth is going to warm, when in fact just the opposite is happening. Fortunately, people are now starting to listen to me since all of the predictions I made have come to pass. I want to expand on that. I want to get everyone aware that a new cold era will be coming. It's not the weather extremes that's important, it's the trend lines. And trend lines are clearly showing we're heading into a cold era.